Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Lauren from Guthrie and Ganny, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you two methods of lining really pretty embroidered eyelet style fabric and then also sheer fabrics as well. So if you have been getting inspired for some spring summer makes recently and are feeling a bit unsure about what to do with some of these fabrics, whether they need lined or not, then I am going to make it really simple and easy to understand. For the two methods that I cover in this video, one I'm calling the flat line method and one that I am calling the make two method. So I have popped timestamp chapters on this video, so if there's a particular method that you're more interested in, then you can just hover along the timeline bar and jump straight to that. I do also have two separate blog posts that go along with this video. One is for each method, so you can also check that out as well for some more step-by-step, some photos and some other tips and links to the patterns and fabrics that I'm going to be showing you as an example as well. So the links to that will be in the description below, and you can get all of the fabrics and patterns that I've mentioned on my website as well, Guthrie and Ganny. So first of all, I'm going to cover some FAQs before we get into the details of each type of lining method. And the first question is should you actually line something or not? And just because something is a little bit sheer or something's a little bit see-through, maybe because it's got lots of embroidery in it like this lovely eyelet or sort of broderie anglaise fabric it gets called as well, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to line it. It just depends on the context of what you're making and where you're going to wear it and what you feel comfortable with as well. So it might be maybe you're making like a sort of beach cover up to take on holiday and you're wearing your swimsuit underneath. So actually if it's a little bit see-through then it might not bother you. Or it might be that you just feel happy enough wearing like a little camisole or a vest top underneath, and you could just make a garment as normal out of these types of fabrics and then just layer it up with something else as well. So don't ever feel like you have to line something. There are always lots of different options. But the next question that I probably most commonly get asked when people do decide to line these types of fabrics is what fabric should you use for lining them? So in this video I'm specifically talking about more of like the spring summery type weights of fabric as opposed to like lining a coat. So for those kind of fabrics you want to be trying to match the properties of your main fabric with the lining fabric. So there's probably like two main ones that you would want to kind of consider. If your fabric is a cotton or a cotton linen mix, so it's quite stable, it's quite crisp, it's got a little bit of structure to it, then you're probably going to want to use a plain cotton voile, which we have just in some basic colours here in the shop. So this one here is like the white one, for example. So it's really lovely and lightweight, but it is cotton, so it does have that crispness and that stability to it as well. The other main one that you would want to consider is just the plain viscose fabric. So this isn't like your sort of typical kind of slippery, like synthetic-y type fabric that you would, you'd maybe see in a coat lining or like a skirt lining or a winter dress lining. This is just regular plain weave viscose, 100% viscose fabric. It's really nice and lightweight and it's got that kind of floppiness and drapiness to it. So if you're working with a fabric that is viscose, that's a bit sheer, or it's a viscose mix, maybe it's mixed with a little bit of polyester, or maybe it's a viscose linen mix where there's quite a high percentage of viscose in it, so the fabric itself is very kind of floppy and fluid, then you would want your lining to kind of mimic that. So in the context of this video and the types of fabrics that we're talking about, they're the two main ones that you would want to be looking at. You could definitely use like a heavier weight cotton as well, something like a poplin, but obviously that's going to add a lot more structure and kind of thickness to your garment. So the cotton voile is quite a good one because it's still quite lightweight, but adding just that thin extra layer can give fabrics just extra opacity and just make them less see-through. So yeah, it does work well with a lot of the types of fabrics that I'm going to show you. So the next question is, do you need a special pattern that has been designed for a lining when you come to make a lined garment, or you're working with a fabric that you feel like it needs lining? The answer is no, you don't. You don't need to have a special lining. You can definitely just add a lining into a pattern already. Whether it's got a bias binding neckline or it might be that it's got a facing instead round the neckline, both are workable with a lining. and it's really easy. I'm going to show you how. So back to the two methods that I mentioned before. We've got the make two method and we've got the flat lining method. So I'm going to do the make two method first. And the example that I'm going to show you that on is this really lovely, nice and lightweight viscose fabric here. It's viscose mixed with a little bit of polyamide. So yeah, it's not 100% viscose, but because it's got a high percentage of viscose, it is really drapey, it's floaty, and you can see that it is a little bit sheer. So I am going to do the make two lining method with this fabric and use the plain weave viscose fabric to line it. So put simply, when you do this method, you make the garment with the outer fabric and you make it with the lining fabric, but you leave the neckline just raw, and then you sew the two separate garments together at the neckline. So although I am using this viscose based fabric to show you this make two method of flat lining, you can definitely do this method with the cotton fabrics as well. I think it just depends on the style and what you're making. In this example, I am using the matchy split peplum tank, which is just like a plain front, but at the back it's got a sort of gathered section at the back bodice. And I just felt that if I was making this out of a cotton fabric, it might add quite a lot of extra volume if I was doing the make two method. So I would probably do something more like the flat lining method if I was making this pattern out of a cotton fabric. So that's just something to bear in mind when you come to decide what method of lining you want to actually choose. So what you need to do is, before you start any construction, I always like to stabilise the neckline, and my preferred way to do this is with the prim forming tape interfacing. So rather than stay stitching the neckline on the machine, I like to use this forming tape interfacing because it's basically like ironing on a stay stitch. So it means that your fabric isn't going through the machine. Sometimes it can get distorted a little bit or put through extra tension and just put out of shape. But with the forming tape interfacing, you can lay your fabric out on the ironing board, wrong side facing up, and then you can just match it up with your paper pattern, make sure the shape of the neckline is correct and it's not sort of distorted or kind of stretched out of place at all, and then you just iron that forming tape interfacing on right next to the raw edge. I usually put the stay stitch that is within the forming tape right close to the raw edge as well, because that's where you would typically be doing your stay stitch. So you can put that on your front and back neckline before you start construction, and then you just know that your necklines are protected, then they're not going to come out of shape. So then you are literally just making these two separate garments effectively, but just leaving the neckline. So finishing off all the seam allowances, you can finish off the hems as well. When it comes to doing the hem, I would recommend making the lining a little bit shorter than the outer fabric. And there's two ways that you can do this. You can either cut a bit off the lining so that that's what makes it shorter, or you can just do a deeper hem. So in the example garment that I made, I did a 1/2 centimetre double turned hem on the outer. So I stitched a line of stitching around the hem, the bottom hem, 1/2 centimetre away from the raw edge, and I used that as a guide to press it back twice. So it was quite a narrow hem in the outer one, but then on the lining fabric I did the same technique but just made the measurements bigger. So I did my line of stitching at 1 centimetre, and then I pressed that back, and then I pressed it again by 1.5 centimetres. So it meant that there's a difference of 1.5 centimetres between my outer and my lining. Now that the 1.5 centimetres is not like a sort of particular rule that it has to be that. I would say, especially with viscose fabric, just because it can sort of hang and droop differently, you probably don't want to go much less than that, maybe 1 centimetre. But if it was a cotton fabric, then maybe you could kind of go a bit closer. The other thing that you might want to do as well is if you're using a fabric that is like one of these sort of border fabrics here. So I've got this gorgeous blue one here, and you can see that it's got this lovely little kind of scalloped edge to it. So if that was going to be the hem on your outer layer, then you would obviously want to make sure that the lining was kind of stopping before the sort of highest point of the scalloped edge. it's kind of the same on this one as well, if you were incorporating that into the garment too. So yeah, it just depends on the context, but the general principle is usually that in the make to method, you're going to want your lining to be a little bit shorter than your main outer fabric. So when you've got your two separate garments and you're coming to attach them at the neckline, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. So if your garment has been designed to have bias binding on the neckline and you want to do that, then what you need to do is put your two garments together with the wrong sides facing. So you're going to put your lining inside the outer garment and make sure that the wrong side of the outer is facing the wrong side of the lining. And then I would baste them together at the neckline so that it effectively becomes one fabric there. The two layers are joined together to become one, and then you can just sew your bias binding onto your neckline. So, and you could do that either where the bias binding is exposed. If you've got a thicker fabric, that's probably a better way to do it, just because there's maybe a bit less bulk. If you want to turn it to the inside, then I would probably tend to use that more on lighter weight fabrics, just because it can add extra bulk when you do that sort of extra turn to the inside, depending on what way you're putting your binding on. But even if your garment has been designed to have binding at the neckline, which is what the matchy pattern in the example I made does have, you don't have to do that. You can kind of sew the lining on a bit like you would a facing. So in this situation, what you have to do is put your lining and your outer layer garment together with right sides facing. So you've got one inside the other again, but this time it's right sides facing. You're then going to sew them together with a regular seam. Now here's where you have to be careful, because if your pattern has been designed to have bias binding on it, then it is going to have quite a narrow seam allowance built in at the neckline. If your garment has been designed to have a facing there, it's likely that the seam allowance will be a bit bigger. It's probably going to be 1 centimetre and 1.5 centimetres, whatever it is for your pattern. So just check that before you sew the two layers together. So you would sew them together, right sides together. You would grade your seam allowances, and then you would clip into it. So you're just making little snips in the seam allowance towards the stitching line, but obviously not cutting into it. And then you're going to understitch it. So you have to pull the lining away from the main outer layer. Make sure that the seam allowances are pointing towards the lining. And I tend not to press this. What I do is I take the little table extension bit off of my sewing machine so that the arm is just sticking out of the sewing machine. Easier to get into that narrower sort of circle opening of the neckline. I feed it through, and then I just gently sort of pull the layers apart as I'm stitching it. And this can just be a little bit easier to control. It's quite awkward to sort of press that, and you can end up pressing creases in it and sort of tucks in it. So if you do it unpressed, but just do it as you're sewing it, and just keep stopping, smoothing the fabric out and sort of pulling it apart, checking that your seam allowances are all towards the lining, so that as you're stitching the understitching, you're catching the seam allowances as well. Then once you've done that, you can then push your lining to the inside, and then the wrong sides of the lining and the main fabric will be facing. Give it a really good press, and you'll find that the understitching just helps it to sort of tuck in and turn to the inside, so you get a lovely clean finish around that neckline. Then if your garment's got sleeves, you would be hemming it using the same principles as the bottom hem. So just making sure that your sleeve hem is a little bit shorter than the outer layer. If it's a sleeveless garment like the one in this example, then you can put bias binding on it. So that's what I did for this one. And what I ended up doing was stitching it on with a 1/2 centimetre seam allowance. I then trimmed the binding strip down a bit because it was just a little bit too wide for the method of binding that I was doing. Once I'd stitched it on, I then understitched it, and then I just folded it once, folded the raw edge once to the inside and turned it again, so the whole binding was on the inside of the garment, and then top stitched it down. So you end up seeing 2 lines of stitching on the inside and 1 on the outside, and then that just finishes off your armholes. And then if you've already done your hems, then you're done. It could be that you maybe leave your hems to last. You can do that as well. Like once you've got everything all in position, you could let the garment hang out and then do your hems later. Or it might be that you can do what I did in this example, which was hem at first. So that is the make to method. So hopefully you can see that it's not as kind of scary as you would think. It's literally just kind of like sewing a facing on, but instead of just like a little section, which is what a facing is, it's a whole other layer of garment. So for the second method, which is the flat lining method, this one is even more simple. So the pattern I have used in this example is the matchy matchy open back smock pattern, which is what I'm wearing just now. So it's got this really cute detail opening at the back. I'm just wearing it over a vest top because it's so open and gapey at the back. But I used this really lovely eyelet fabric, floral eyelet fabric. So I just wanted to have a layer underneath it so that it would fill all the holes. And then because the fabric was quite lightweight, it just generally gives more opacity to the lightweightness of the fabric as well. So for this one, you are cutting out your lining fabric and you're cutting out your main fabric for your main pieces. And then what you're going to do is, before you do any construction at all, you're going to get your lining and your main outer fabric. You're going to put them together with the wrong sides facing, and you're going to baste them together within the seam allowance with a nice long stitch length. And this then effectively makes those two layers of fabric one. So you then just continue the construction of your garment as per the instructions. You don't need to do anything else majorly different. Just treat it as one layer of fabric, and then the fabric will automatically be lined as you do it. Now with your seam finishes in this example, it's good if you've got an overlocker. It's nice and easy, it's not adding lots of extra bulk, or it might be you're just using an overcast stitch on the sewing machine. If you've got those two layers as one, seam finishes like flat felled seams or French seams can tend to get quite a bit bulky because you've got those extra layers of fabric. But it might just depend on what fabric you're using. But I would just sort of use those types of seam finishing methods with caution, just because it can add a lot of extra bulk. I would say either overlocker or just an overcast foot in the sewing machine is probably the easiest for just not adding much bulk. So you just literally just construct it as you normally would. When you come to do the hem, you're just folding it. I just did a double turned hem as it's intended on this top here. The main thing you have to do is, as you're folding the hem, just make sure that the lining is really sort of tucked in, just so that it doesn't sort of bubble or kind of get pushed up as you're pressing it. But generally speaking, it's quite easy and it's fine, and it just all presses nice and flat. Then when you come to do the neckline, you are then going to be binding it. I would probably say that's the best method for sort of finishing it off. If you're working with a garment that has a facing, then I would consider maybe just switching it out and doing some binding instead. You could do a facing and just do it with one layer of fabric, but it might just add a little bit of too much extra bulk, because then it would be like you had 3 layers of fabric over quite a big section. But it might just depend on what you're making. But my personal preference would probably just be to bind it. So what I did on this example here was I made binding strips out of the lining fabric, so that's what I used for the binding. And instead of pressing it so that you're pressing the binding like in towards the raw edges, in towards the center, which effectively creates like 4 layers of fabric by the time you're sewing it on, instead what I did was I just put right sides together, I stitched it on, I then understitched it, and then I trimmed it back a little bit, probably by about 0.5 centimetre on this particular pattern. Obviously binding widths will vary pattern to pattern, but on this one I trimmed it 0.5 centimetre, and then I just pressed it once, pressed the raw edges over once, and then turned it again. So effectively it was like there was 3 layers of the bias binding rather than 4. And it also meant that the binding was on the inside as well, so at the neckline and then at my armholes as well. You don't see the binding from the outside, so you see 2 lines of stitching on the inside and 1 line of stitching on the outside, and then that is what finishes it off. If your garment has any button bands at all, then you kind of treat it a bit like a hem, so you can just press it as you normally would. That's what I did on here. Although the button band doesn't go all the way down the back, it does have interfacing down the back where that opening is. So I just ironed the interfacing on to the back of the fabric like I would have if it was 1 layer. I pressed it like I would if it was 1 layer, stitched it down, everything, and it was absolutely fine. So when you're working with these types of lightweight fabrics, and it's two lightweight fabrics coming together, it's still fine to do all of that. And it creates the right amount of structure. Having the hem, it helps to sort of keep the shape of the garment, and then obviously you want that sort of structure in the button band at the back. So I hope you have found that useful, and just seeing those two different methods and deciding on when you would apply them to different types of patterns and different types of fabrics as well. You can do each type of method with various different types of fabric. It just all depends really on the fabric and the pattern and how it's constructed and everything. But hopefully seeing some examples of them just will give you the confidence to try and think it through a little bit more, and just be able to decide what method you want to try out for your projects. If you're not sure at all, if you've got any questions, the G&G team and I are always more than happy to help. You can always call or email us. You can leave a comment on this video as well. Sometimes it might take a bit of time to get back to you, so if you want a quick answer, it's always best to email. So remember, all of these fabrics are on the website. There's 2 blog posts that go along with this video as well, to show the step-by-steps for each method, so you can check them out as well. Links are in the description. But thanks so much for watching, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, then don't forget to hit subscribe and give me a thumbs up if you like this video, and I will see you next time. Bye.